Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back another video from Annie News. We got more cut content from season 3, season 2, episode 3. So before this, we checked out Sara's backstory. It was interesting, got more in depth on why she was acting the way she was. But now let's see what's actually cut from the episode itself.
Episode 2 suffered so that Episode 3 could thrive. We may have lost out on some epic fights, but in return we were given a proper emotional climax.
Oh god, yeah.
This portrayal of Rudy's path
God.
through depression that culminates in several unlikely decisions on his part.
God, that moment happened so quick as well. I was just like, whoa!
We also didn't get much when it came to Sara's perspective, but that's actually something that I focused on last video.
It's good as well, check that
So,
out.
as we go through the emotional roller coaster that is Episode 3, we'll get to see exactly what it is Rudy's thinking as he teeters in and out on the edge of despair.
Right.
That and a few interesting details that makes Zoldat even cooler. Episode 27, Abrupt Approach, covering chapters 5 and 6 from Volume 7 of the light novel.
Okie dokie.
With a year having passed since Rudy had come to Rosenberg, not only was he well known by pretty much everyone, but his increased cooperation with Counter Arrow had made him significantly closer with them.
Which is class.
After
Right, it was
having
nice to
saved Sara
see.
all those months ago, it seemed like they were being a lot more deliberate in partying up with him. So much so that they would practically wait for him outside the Adventurers Guild. What started out as an occurrence that happened only once every 5 missions, slowly became 1 in 3, then 1 in 2, and now 4 in 5.
6.
For all intents and purposes, he was practically one of them now. That being the case, it was only natural he get closer with Sara too, especially considering just how much more comfortable she was around him now. I'm not gonna go over her backstory again since the last
Yeah.
video I did goes extremely in depth with that. Instead, we'll just go straight to their date.
Makes sense.
So, since Sara wanted Suzanne to teach her how to use a sword, she first needed to replace her old one. A task she felt Rudy would have some insight in since he was after all an intermediate sword fighter. Of course, Rudy had no idea the difference between a good sword and a bad sword, but that didn't stop him from agreeing to go anyway.
Of course, it's like, yeah, let's jump on this. Alright.
It was the first date he'd been on since that one time he went clothes shopping with Eris and Millis. When he reminisced on the outfits he saw then, it reminded him that he didn't really have anything date-worthy. The only pieces of clothing he'd ever wear was his robe and undershirt.
Just the same
So,
stuff
with
all the
no
time.
time to buy anything and no sense on what was even fashionable, Rudy accepted the fact he would have to show up looking the same way he always did.
Damn.
That wasn't really that big of a deal though, since to him this wasn't really even a date anyway. Since he didn't want to go and get too ahead of himself, Rudy convinced himself that he was simply accompanying her. There was no way he would allow himself
Calm
to think
himself
it was
down.
anything more.
Just be like, it's okay. Let's just, if I convince myself it's not a date, then I will be calmer.
I mean, the very idea of Sara being interested was just absurd to him. When she showed up looking the way that she did though, that's when Rudy thought that perhaps she actually was interested.
Oh.
Her hair was brushed, her outfit changed, and clear effort was put into being presentable. With Rudy's self-confidence still at an all-time low though, he still wasn't convinced Sara liked him for, well,
Him? Yeah.
no. He was instead convinced she only liked him because he had saved her, chalking it up to some form or the other of crisis bonding. It's not like he'd tried to get himself on her route, but somehow he still ended up on it anyway. It was a pleasant surprise that also happened to stir all sorts of fear within him. He wasn't unhappy that a girl was interested in him, but his
yeah.
lack of reciprocal feelings made him unsure as how to react to all of it. So, rather than jump straight in and overcommit, Rudy instead decided to go with the flow. He would tame his expectations and go about the day normally, thinking that getting too close too soon would only lead to disappointment. Now,
Oh.
the shop the two went to look for swords was a high-quality place known for their imports from the Asura Kingdom, a store that recently grew in popularity simply due to the sharp increase in the quality of their imports.
See what he did
If
there?
Rudy-
Sharp increase. Swords.
Had to guess, it was likely the caravan he came up with was carrying goods for here. It was an expensive place with a limited selection, but the difference in
axe.
quality you'd get was potentially life-saving. Even Rudy understood just how important a reliable secondary weapon was. An interesting thing to note about the shop itself is that while there were all sorts of weapons from staves to maces, there wasn't a single lancer spear here. Since those were the weapons associated with spurs, they were often considered the devil's weapons.
Oh, okay.
And it was for that reason that
Interesting.
both adventurers and merchants avoided them.
Oh, wow.
When Sara finally made her way back to the short swords, there were two options from which she couldn't choose from. A curved, balanced one clearly intended for more delicate work, and a longer, thicker one that provided better impact. The former was especially useful for Sara's crafting, but if her intent was to have a sword to use against monsters, then the latter was by far the better choice. Since Rudy thought that both were useful to her though, he just recommended that she buy both. The thing is, carrying both swords would definitely be way too heavy for her. It would also get in the way of her using her bow.
Oh, yeah.
So, as a potential alternative, Rudy suggested getting a smaller knife to keep in her bag, in addition to that larger sword that was meant for fighting. It was the best option considering she needed a sword for making arrows, but to buy both
yeah,
was
makes
just
sense,
a bit
makes
too
sense.
expensive for her, leading Rudy to offer up some of his own money to pay for it.
Oh.
Since he rarely ever bought more than the bare necessities, he had actually amassed quite a bit of wealth the past year. Certainly enough to help out Sara, and even a bit extra to buy some swords for himself. Now, it was after all that the two would window shop through the city's more expensive stores. Magical implements so exorbitant that even a full year's worth of adventuring wouldn't be able to afford them.
Damn.
They then proceeded to get some drinks, and it was here that Sara's advances would give Rudy the courage to move forward a bit. He didn't want to be too hasty though, since if this relationship ended the same way that the one with Eris did, then he wasn't sure that he'd ever be able to recover.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able
So,
to
after making
deal
sure
with
that this
twice.
was in fact what Sara wanted, they would go back to his inn just like how we saw in the anime. The only difference between here and the disastrous aftermath was the innkeeper, who also happened to make a pretty good wingman. You see, when he saw that Rudy had finally brought a girl back home with him, he immediately ran to the kitchen, grabbed a flask, then tossed it to him.
Oh,
Rudy wasn't very familiar with alcohol, but by the looks of this one, it was definitely one of the more expensive
what a
ones.
bro. What a
The
bro.
innkeeper clearly wanted him to have a good time tonight. But what that flask ended up being used for instead was to wash away any memory of the disaster that just happened. The absolute mess that occurred as Rudy came to the realization that he was impotent. An important distinction that needs to be made from the anime is that Sara's parting words weren't a direct attack on Rudy. Yes, she did think the whole thing was an absolute train wreck, but her saying awful wasn't her calling Rudy awful.
Oh,
She was just describing the situation in general.
what a disaster.
Since Rudy perceived it as her calling him a disaster, though, he began to think that perhaps this was how Eris felt. Perhaps she had actually been unwilling that entire night. Perhaps she was just enduring how awful it was for Rudy's sake.
Oh, no.
Regardless of what it was, Rudy now felt a chill that could only be relieved by drinking, bringing us to his downward spiral and eventual encounter with Zoldat.
Mate.
Rudy had
He
never
just
drunk
kept punching him in the face, and he's like, look, I know you can take me in a fight. You know you're going to beat me up now. Oh, God.
alcohol to such an extent before, but now that he had, he found it felt surprisingly good. So much so that if he was to get alcohol poisoning and die, to die feeling this good would just be a miracle.
God, depressing.
It was as he got
No.
more and more drunk that his attitude became more and more like his former self. He began to notice he was lashing out in anger much like how he did in his old life. Then, the more he realized he was relapsing into his old self, the more he drank to make himself feel better about it. It was a vicious cycle fueled by his own remorse and regret, one that minimized all those years of progress he'd made. When Zoldat entered the bar shortly after, the only reason he had confronted Rudy at all was to demand he leave so that he didn't have to be anywhere near his sorry face. Then, with the emotional breakdown capturing pretty much every aspect of the novels, we can skip ahead to their conversation after, the essence of which was that Rudy needed to stop lying to himself. The entire year he'd spent in Rosenberg, not once was he ever his true self. He had put up a mask and kept himself stiff and formal, which in turn caused the toxic buildup we saw just a moment ago. The lies he was telling himself were like a poison to him, constantly building up under the pressure of maintaining this false identity. The next thing Zoldat said to get Rudy to feel better was a lecture on the futility of trying to understand women, a lesson that was essentially trying to get him to move on. He could spend all the time in the world contemplating the reasons why Eris left him, but the truth of the matter was that none would ever be the right one. So, if he kept harping on all these depressing situations that had no solutions, then it was only natural his life would become depressing too.
Yeah.
What he needed to focus on instead was the root of the problem, something that could only be done through the help of a professional. They couldn't just go to a cheap place though, since the service there wouldn't be anything close to what Rudy
Hell
needed.
yeah.
No,
Go
if
for
he was gonna
premium.
figure out the cause of his impotence, then any and all techniques were required for testing purposes. Something that was only available from the more expensive locations.
Get the good stuff.
Now, normally Rudy wouldn't be caught anywhere near here, but part of him was actually pretty excited. In his old life, he would look down on those who came to places like this, but after feeling just how exhilarating the anticipation was, he now understood that he was just being naive and foolish. Even the act of going into the brothel would have been intimidating, but because he was following the likes of Zoldat, for some reason it just felt easier. He seemed like the type of guy that you could just trust to lead you anywhere. He never did
In all
understand.
fairness, in this episode, he did seem like a really cool bloke. He did end up being really, really sound. Like, there's not many people I know that would take a beat into the face and then go out drinking with you.
Zoldat was
Especially take you to a brothel like that.
ranked
Like,
party leader, but after following him for only a few hours, Rudy felt it made a lot more sense now. Everything just felt a whole lot more safe with him. As for the reason he was a regular at this brothel, well, that's because relationships within his party were prohibited. If any two adventurers were found to even have feelings for each other, then both members would be asked to leave immediately.
oh, wow, okay.
There was just too much
Strict.
risk in having that type of relationship present, much to the point that it became highly dangerous for everyone in the party. It was definitely natural for romantic bonds to be made in such high-pressure life-and-death situations, but Zoldat had no problem cycling those people out as many times as he needed to.
Damn. What
Sure,
okay.
it was a hassle to bring in all
Sticks
these
to
new
his
members, but with a little tactical rework and a couple days of practice, his party would be running as good as new again. In any case, it was after the two arrived at the brothel that Zoldat would order the most expensive itinerary for Rudy. Since pricing determined what
dude.
the escorts
What
would and
a
wouldn't do,
dude.
it was only natural they go with the one with the most options. He would then pick an escort that looked like Eris and proceed to what was essentially the cleansing part of the experience. This wasn't really all that important, but prior to even getting to see Elise, he was first taken to a bath where younger girls would clean literally every inch of him. It was an experience in itself that a younger Rudy would have celebrated at, but unfortunately for him generated zero response still. Fast forward to the actual experience with Elise, and while the whole thing was extremely sensual, no amount of physical sensation would work on him. She had even gone so far as to try things not on the itinerary, but his body's response was always the same. Rudy could definitely see why she was considered a professional, but no matter how good those dreamlike sensations felt, everything just remained silent. Now, something the anime didn't include was the fact that Elise had accompanied Rudy all the way to when he left the pleasure district. Since she wasn't able to help him with his problems, it was the least she could do to escort him outside.
Oh, okay.
So, when Sara had stumbled upon Rudy at the entrance of the pleasure district, not only did she see him drunk with the person she hated most, but she also saw Rudy get a kiss from an escort he most likely slept with.
That's gonna add to
It was an
innit?
additional catalyst to an
Jesus.
already explosive situation.
Right.
One that cemented Rudy's fate to that of rejection.
Oh.
So, when all was said and done and Sara's rejection made clear, what bothered Rudy the most was the inevitable repercussions. As adventurers, it was only natural that they'd run into each other again. For sure, Sara was gonna keep looking at him with disgust, but it was the thought of Suzanne, Timothy, and Patrice doing the same that devastated him enough to want to end it all. He couldn't handle knowing that the only friendship he'd cultivated over the past year was effectively over in only a matter of seconds.
Damn.
It was a truly unbearable pain that he just didn't want to live with anymore. If not through death, then at the very least not by his lonesome. After coming so far and falling so flat, to him this was the most that he would ever amount to. He tried his best and reached his limit. There was no point to trying to do anything on his own anymore. Best to just go back to Paul and be with them. It was when Zoldat accepted Rudy for who he was next that he also went on to admit his own faults. He acknowledged that he may have gone a bit too far when prodding him all the time, knowing now that there were some things that people just wanted kept secret. With yet another surprising statement showing his true character, Rudy now felt he fully understood why he was such a capable leader. Sure, he may have plenty of his own faults and shortcomings, but his good traits far outweighed the bad ones. It was a point made clear by the fact he had spent the entire night looking out for him, the same night he should have spent preparing to leave for the labyrinth. So it was that realization combined with his desire to not be alone that led Rudy to the decision to go along with him, bringing us now to the end of episode 3. That's pretty much it for today's cut content.
Fair enough, cool.
If you're wondering about episode 2, I'll try to go back and finish it up next week, probably if I have time after episode 4. If you want to know more about Sara too, that was a whole cut content in and of itself. So you can find those links down in the description. That and a link to my Twitch where I talk about Mushoku Tensei every Sunday. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao.
Fair enough. Cool. It's always good to see stuff that's been missed out. Those little extras. And yeah, the way that she described the situation instead of it being Rudy himself as she left. Interesting one. Yeah, I'm loving Mushoku Tensei Season 2. It's so freaking good. I just missed the big battles, but I'm sure we'll get into stuff like that later on down the line. But yeah, make sure you check out my Etsy shop, link in the description for t-shirts and hoodies that I have designed. And thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, link is in the description to the Patreon page. $1 a month / support channel. Greatly appreciated. Thank you guys very much for that. Thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe, and leave comments down below. Let me know that you watch some future videos. I'll see you guys next time.